Hello and welcome everybody to this discussion hosted by the RSA. I'm Anna Markland, Head of Innovation and Change here at the RSA, and I'll be your chair for the conversation today. I'm delighted to be joined by this esteemed panel and would like to welcome Robin Dunbar, Tracey Camilleri and Samantha Rockey. Hello everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
And really great to have you joining us today. Thank you so much for your time. And let me introduce you formally. So Robin Dunbar is Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and his popular science books include The Human Story and How Many Friends Does One Person Need?, both of which have been translated into a dozen languages. Hi, Robin.
Hello.
Tracey Camilleri and Samantha Rockey are both Associate Fellows at Oxford University Said Business School and co-founders of Thompson Harrison, an organisation specialising in leadership and organisational development. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
If you're watching along live, we'd love you to get involved in the chat. So please do share your thoughts and comments. And if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag RSA Social Brain. Right, well, I think that's everything that we wanted to say. So all that's left now is to dive into the conversation. I was lucky to get a hot off the press copy of the book, and there was so much that I wanted to explore with you all further. To start us off, a question to you, Robin. The book is called The Social Brain. Would you like to begin by giving an overview of the social brain theory and how it makes us think about human groups in a different way?
Well, I guess the social brain hypothesis, as it's formally known, is an explanation for why monkeys and apes have enormous brains by comparison with all other animals. And the explanation is that they live in very complex social groups. And these are not only groups which are relatively large by the size of other species of animals and birds, in terms of stable groups at least, but also they have this very unique characteristic of bonded relationships where individuals engage in a lot of grooming with each other in particular, which sets up these very close, intimate friendships, you might say. And I guess that kind of pitch, that kind of understanding of how our natural social communities actually work, and they really work in exactly the same way, they're just a bit bigger still than the kinds of groups you find in monkeys and apes, that really maps across into many different walks of life, and in particular in this particular context, the world of work, that the world of work is a social world, and therefore understanding it in terms of our natural social predispositions may help us to have a better guide to how best to manage it in order to get the most out of the world of work for the purposes of work on the one hand, but also how to get the best out of the world of work for the benefit of those who work, that you know, they don't feel it's an alien environment, that they feel it's very much a part of their natural, almost home environment, if you like.
Thank you. And following on from that, Tracey, I guess why is this such an important concept to be thinking about now?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, as Robin said, he spent a lot of time thinking about the science behind this, and Sam and I have spent, our whole careers actually really exploring the practice of, you know, how when you bring a group together, some groups end up as being more than the sum of their parts, and some actually bring one another down. And I think there are three things at the moment that make this an important area for focus. I mean, one is the obvious situation of the pandemic, where our relational, our social connection was, you know, ground to a halt. I remember doing a birthday party with my ancient mother and her trying to pass me a glass of wine through the screen, you know, and she was in Wiltshire and I was in Norfolk, and that sort of sense that actually, you know, what we need, which is to come together and to be in friendship and relationship with another, was stopped by that. The second thing is now, you know, post-pandemic, I don't know whether we're post-pandemic, but in this sort of hybrid world, you know, we really need to think when we come together, it needs to matter. You know, we need to make it count. And I think with Robin, there are so many things we've been thinking about that are actually easy things that we can do, working with the grain of our natural inherited psychology, and some difficult things as well. But we are working with organizations that are really struggling to think what's the right ratio between working from home, working virtually, and when we come together, how can we make it much more human? And the third thing is, it's an interesting time at the moment where companies are really rethinking the shape of their organizations. They're rethinking the shape of teams, the size of teams. It's a moment of kind of reimagining work. In some ways, it's a hopeful moment. And so, you know, what we're hoping that our research and our thinking will just form part of that reimagining.
That last bit really resonates. I like the idea that this is a time for change being possible, and your book as a guide to people on how they can do that. I'd love to come next to Samantha on a slightly different question. So you obviously wrote this book as a group, as a trio, and I just wanted to understand a little bit around, did some of the dynamics that you talk about in the book come up for you guys when you were working together, and what was that experience like?
Well, I think we actually had a very interesting experience because we wrote a lot of the book during lockdown, so we had to deploy technology. But both Tracey and I had met Rob, and I'd certainly met him before we came together as a group when I was working with a large organization, and we actually brought a group of our CEOs to a program at Oxford, and Tracey was working at the business school, and Robin came and did a presentation. So the three of us were in a room together, and after that, this was about maybe 10 years ago, and we kind of got together after the session when some of the leaders from the organization I was working with came up to me and said, that is the most phenomenal and really interesting research. Surely it has practical application back at work. So really, at that moment, there was a kind of slight beginning of this sort of serendipitous moment of, you know, from a client side, and then from the business school side, and from Robin's side, all coming together. So there was a sense of bonding sort of back in the day, which I think in our book we talk a lot about, actually, the benefit, and we had spent time together. And then we really did practice what we preached, actually. When we were allowed to meet for meals, we did that. We met together as a group, and I think we had sort of wonderful moments spending a number of days together, actually just really noodling through what we wanted to put in our book. So I like to think we practiced what we preached, and you know, we also allowed space for some dissent, which I think is really important as part of a group process, but always with the sort of kindness and care, I think, that needs to accompany that. So yeah, I think we did a good job, actually, at practicing what we had written about.
And do you have a fond memory from the process of working together? And that's actually a question for all of you guys. What kind of stands out as a moment of coming together and bonding as a group?
Well, I have a particularly fond memory because it's my bad pronunciation. We talk a lot about homophily, which took me an endless amount of time to practice how to say it. And eventually Robin just leaned forward and said, let's just call it friends. So I felt there was such a kindness to my poor pronunciation. I know how to pronounce.
I think I would say that it was humor, actually, that you know, kept us going, especially when we were all apart trying to write a book and structure a book. Actually, a three-way structuring a book is hard, but we did sometimes laugh till we cried, and that was a very we sometimes cried and then laughed afterwards. But and as Sam said, eating together, and you know, Robin was very generous, and so we quite often ate in Magdalen College. And there's something about, you know, the ritual and the structure and the, you know, the sort of the ways of eating in college that again was lovely, and was a real part of us working together and putting the book into a final shape.
I agree. It was the humor. That's what did it.
Yes.
That's such a joy, a nice experience coming all together with that. I was also quite amused to see in the book that you talk about how, as humans, we find our music preferences an indicator of potential friendship. How are your guys' music preferences aligned?
Oh well, this was the beginning of the great saga, because in some sense I discovered Tracey because she was sitting listening to her son sing in our college choir. I occasionally used to drop it to listen to them perform, and so I thought, well, she must be good. She likes the same music as me.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add, we use music a lot, actually, in the work that we do as a real backdrop for people coming together. And of course, all these technologies have emerged around about the same time. So Spotify lists is something that we always get people to contribute their favorite songs. And we have found a real nourishment, actually, for people's experience at work through music, through using music and discovering each other. So we almost on every single program and every engagement will encourage people to share what their music taste is. And it is an absolute fast track to bonding, you know, two people discovering their shared love of classical music or pop music or whatever it is. It's the beginning of a really a wonderful conversation that can take place in an unexpected way.
I guess this actually goes back to an important point that's very germane that we talk quite a bit about in the book, and that is the dynamics that underpin friendships in everyday life. And as a result of the research we've done, we came up with this idea of the 7 pillars of friendship, which are kind of like 7 dimensions, which, if you shared these dimensions with somebody, it paves the way, if you like, for the creation of a friendship. One of those is humor, or your sense of humor. And the other is your taste in music. Of course, there are all sorts of other things like your moral and political views, and your hobbies and interests, the things you like doing, and you know, little things like where you come from as a point of common contact. You know, my goodness, we must have walked the same streets and sat in the same pubs, even if we did it 20 years apart, kind of thing. So all those kind of things that kind of define you as a person and become important points of contact to create relationships, or to fast track the creation of relationships. And I guess what you two have been doing with some of your practice has been implementing that, in particular, allowing people to identify those quickly, or helping them identify, so that they can build, if you like, functional relationships much more quickly than might otherwise happen in the cold world of work, where it's full of strangers that we don't know.
Could I actually stick with you, Robin, and ask a little bit more, because I think we've alluded and we maybe assume that people watching know about the Dunbar number and how that relates to forming friendships. And I wonder if you could actually maybe take a step back and say a little bit more about what is exactly the Dunbar number, how does that play in the social brain theory, and how does it influence, or how is it influenced by our understanding of human biology and inherited behaviors?
Okay, the Dunbar number is really the number of relationships that anybody can maintain at any one time. So these are meaningful relationships. You know, they're sort of not relationships with I don't know, your barista that you collect your latte from on the way to work every morning. They're meaningful relationships in your life, and typically they would be about half family, extended family members, and the other half friends. That number's about 150. That number came as a prediction off the back of equation relating social group size in monkeys and apes to the size of their brains. We simply plugged in the size of human brains, and the number that came out was 150. The number we get empirically from looking at things like the number of people that you've phone during the course of a year, for example, and this is on a huge database. I think it's 20% of an entire country, European country, which remains nameless. But there are something like 6 billion phone calls involved. So it's a massive sample. The number 150 comes up out of there. If you look at the number of friends people have on Facebook, there's a very nice sample of that. 61 million Facebook pages. The average number of friends is exactly 149. You can't get closer than 150. So that's the sort of base number. But it turns out that if you look at something like the traffic that people post, named postings on Facebook, or whom they call and how often they call them on their phones, the picture you get of your social network of 150 people is much more like the ripples on a pond. If you imagine yourself as the stone thrown into a pond and you're surrounded by these series of ripples going out, our social networks have that same kind of fractal structure. So you have a very small inner core of about 5 people who are extremely meaningful to you, your intimate friends and family, if you like, and then the numbers go out in a very ordered sequence. The next layer is 15 people, the next 50 people, then 150 people, and there are layers beyond that, but they are obviously, sort of people we would class as acquaintances rather than friends, perhaps. So the issue with these numbers is that actually what creates them in many ways is the flow of information around the system. They seem to work especially well in terms of facilitating the flow of information around the system. However you measure that information, it could be the frequency that you phone people, the frequency that you tell people things, or just how you feel about them, if you like. It's all in a cybernetic sense, information. Now, what that sort of implies is that these different layers have different characteristics of friendship. So the inner core ones are very intense. You don't really have to think or ask people what they're thinking, because you just know them so well. Whereas maybe people in the outer layers you have some empathy with, but you perhaps don't know as intimately. And people have kind of hovered around the idea, I think, for many years, that different kinds of functional work groups that you might have in a work environment might have ideal sizes, that you can't just sort of shoehorn 20 people into a committee to solve a problem, because what will happen is, probably 15 of them will drift off, especially if it's on Zoom. 15 of them will drift off to check their news feed. So that maybe there are optimal group sizes for different sort of functions, and that seems to be the case, that if you have something that needs a lot of intense work by people who really understand how each other think, 5 is probably the upper limit you can do on that. Whereas if you want a group to bandy ideas about and come up with blue skies thinking, and you really need a bigger group which will include more voices. But the cost you bear for that is, you really, most of you won't necessarily be on the same page, so you'll have to stop and explain stuff to everybody else. Whereas a very small intimate group that just knows all these things, you don't have to explain the background details to. They understand your jokes without you having to explain them, basically.
Well, that brings me back to Tracey and Samantha, and you were talking about how when you were working with different groups, you found that there is potential to use this number. As you were saying, there's potential to use some of the insights in your book to reimagine the world of work. So Tracey, coming to you first, how might we use some of this insight that Robin's just shared into how we design organizations?
Well, there are a couple of things that come straight to mind. I mean, one is, as Robin already alluded to, and when we interviewed a lot of people leading teams, large and small, in hugely different arenas, from army generals through to conductors of orchestras, to entrepreneurs, to designers, and so on, and asked them about their practice and their experience. And I think one army general said, this small group where, as Robin says, one can mentalize with each other. I know what you're thinking about, what Sam's thinking about, what Robin's thinking, without having to debrief. And he said, that small fire group in the army, that's what people put their life on the line for, that intense sense of loyalty. At 15, as Robin said, again, it's a great size of group for taking decisions. And I think, what we've been interested in, Sam and I, is a different kind of leadership, also the different styles of leadership that you need at different scales. So actually with 5 or so people, great for creative teams and crisis teams and so on. You don't need a leader. You might need some permissive leader at the side who gives you permission to go at pace, probably faster than the rest of the organization. A kind of permissive, protective, facilitative, keeping a weather eye that you don't get too out of pace with everybody else. At 15, you need facilitative leadership, people who can convene, can mediate, can, as Robin said, bring in the voices. And I mean, I don't know about you, but we've been in lots of meetings that have been too big over the last few years, especially on Zoom. And that leadership ability to create a structure, to bring in voices, particularly around complex decision making. I mean, I know, Anna, you're interested in entrepreneurship and innovation and so on. 50 is a really interesting number we found for founders and entrepreneurs. It's a number at which suddenly you need, and Robin talked about the way information passes around the system. And I think it's a number at which founders suddenly feel, their heads are going to explode, and this, regret, it's not like the old days, and the need to put structure in. And we found, quite interestingly, people tend to move from 50 to 150 quite quickly, because you need to put layers and specialists in at that layer. And then at 150, as you're at the edge of the Dunbar number, I can't remember who it was who said, beyond that, the weird stuff happens, the sort of stand on a chair number. Beyond 150, you stand on a chair and shout, you probably can't be heard. And, beyond that, as a leader, you actually take on a symbolic function. You can't know everyone you're leading. They project their hopes and fears onto you, and you actually need to be resilient enough to take it, but also cognizant that even gestures that you make can be hugely powerful symbolically for the people you lead. So we've been interested in this this question of leadership at different scales, and also mapping particular tasks to particular sizes. So that's one aspect of that. There are other aspects of this reimagining, but that's one we've been very, very interested in.
That's fantastic. And I wonder if, Samantha, you had something you wanted to build on, if that's one aspect that Tracey just shared. Is there other things that have been on your mind?
Yes, I mean, what's been really interesting to us actually is that organizations are kind of thinking and looking into the future, and recognizing that there needs to be sort of a deliberate and dedicated focus on something like a social strategy. And we use the word strategy absolutely deliberately, because you have a marketing strategy, you'll have a finance strategy, but of course a social strategy is as important, because it's those moments of creating connection, the ability to create the space for things like friendship to evolve and develop at work is really important. And Robin speaks a lot about the research in the last decade, actually, and the impact of close relationships on health and well-being. So these things can't be left up to chance. You can't imagine that people are going to craft this for themselves. Some of the most successful organizations that we work with are very deliberate about things like bringing people together over meals. Certainly in our work, we've seen organizations that have canteens, which have kind of been in and out of fashion over the years. Actually, when there is a canteen, the benefit of that far extends the sort of opportunity for kind of getting a lunch together. But actually, those moments of connection, those moments of feeling a sense of well-being towards your fellow colleague, I mean, that stretches on into work. So we write a lot in our book about kind of putting a social strategy back at the heart of how organizations see themselves.
Yes, and I think you mentioned that some sports teams have cultural coaches, and I wonder if that's a practice that you're seeing elsewhere as well.
Well, certainly some of the clients that we're working with at the moment are very particular about a social strategy. And in fact, we work with a client who's taken that even probably to the next step, which is that when people leave the organization, they actually send a small forget-me-not plant or message to say, we're still thinking about you. You're not part of us at this moment, but you'll be forever part of our system. And I think it's that power, that's what connects us as humans. So we are very excited actually about some of the real forward thinking that we're seeing in this space, and just the long-term benefits on all the important indicators, including discretionary effort and performance. So it's not just a sense of health and well-being, it has so many other benefits to the organization as well.
That's a really interesting point around the longevity of our networks and how they tend to stay with us. And I wanted actually to throw a question to Robin, because at the RSA, we've been looking at social networks, and we've been working with Raj Chetty to understand, what does it look like? Who are in our social networks, and how does that link to social mobility? And I guess what I wanted to get your thoughts on is, how fixed or movable is our Dunbar circle? And is there a point in life when it crystallizes? And are you always part of your kind of former work, or does it, how can you sort of move between circles? What does it mean? And as I said, what does it really mean for social mobility and our world of work in connection to that?
Well, there's nothing permanent about the membership of your social network, your circle of 150 friends and family. They are simply, if you like, slots that you can manage, and these slots gain and lose people over time for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, actually, there's a sort of whole life history process here, because you start out life with a social circle of sort of 1.5 or something like that, and you gradually extend the layers outwards, it seems, and you don't really get to your 150 till you're probably in your early 20s, and then it stabilizes for a long time. It may overshoot actually in the early 20s a little bit as people sort of explore more relationships, but it sort of stabilizes by the 30s and stays about 150 till you get to some old age, considerably older than me, I hope, where it starts to decline again at the other end. And if you live long enough, I guess you probably end up back at 1.5 at the opposite end of life. But the point about this really is how even the size of those circles does have a natural trajectory over the lifetime, but who you include in that circle will also vary. And there's a modestly high turnover. It's particularly high, we've found, in the sort of late teens, early 20s age group. They can, people in friends, at least in their networks, can change position as much as 40% of their total cohort of friends can move position during the course of a year. That's a very, very high frequency. Whereas the number of who's in your innermost circle, that group of 5, what we sometimes call the shoulders to cry on friends, the ones who will sort of come and pick you up when your world falls apart, that is much more stable. Those are much more like lifelong relationships. It takes, you probably somebody only moves out of that circle and is replaced about once every 2 or 3 years, something of that sort. It's a very low rate of turnover. And those tend to be your intimate friends, which you've known for a very long time. Whereas further out, there's quite a lot of movement going on as you meet people. You just sort of, well, let's put it this way: if you meet new people, if you want to get to know them better, you've got to drop somebody else. Right? It's as simple as that. So, you arrive at your first day at your new place of work, and you're suddenly exposed to a large number of new people. Now, most of those would normally sit in the kind of acquaintances layer out immediately beyond your 150. So they're people you'd go and have a beer with them after work maybe, but you would never invite them home for your big 50th birthday party or whatever it may be. If you, some of them could turn out actually to be very good friends, and if you want to bring them into the inner circles and see more of them, I'm afraid time is a constraint in the social world as well as the world of work. So you have to make a decision to just see somebody else less often. So there's a lot of churn, as the technical term in social networks has it, in the composition of networks, the membership of networks, which is fine. That's to be expected, and it's not to be worried about. And I guess actually, just reflecting back on lockdown, lockdown witnessed a lot of turnover in people's friendships for just this reason, because it allowed them to step back for a minute and evaluate particular friendships, or they bumped into people that they were doing sort of volunteering, taking, I don't know, elderly folks' medicines round from the chemist and all this kind of thing, and discovered there were actually some quite nice people next door to them. They'd like to see more of them. So other people had to be dropped from the immediate circle to make room for them. So that kind of turnover is just part of life, I think.
It sounds like, though, actually we can be a bit more intentional. And I wonder if I can ask Tracey and Samantha, maybe coming first to you, Tracey, around how can leaders play a role in helping us think about who do we want in our circle, and helping us maybe move some work acquaintances into being more closer, more intimate shoulders to cry on? And what are the kind of roles that the social brain suggests for leaders to play?
That's a very good question. And as organizational development specialists, we've been really attracted by the dynamism of the Dunbar graph, as opposed to, if you think about a traditional kind of org chart, the very, pyramidal kind of static shape of it. Whereas this idea of, the ripples in a pool, this sort of sense, a flatter sense, more, if we think of it in organizational shape terms, more fractal, more like a honeycomb, flatter. And that sense of, as you say, Anna, being intentional about, if you're a leader and you change your strategy, or, there's a huge contextual change, who's in your 15? Who are you spending 60% of your time with? Are they the right people? And that then leads you on to the skills of, making relationship and breaking relationship in a really civilized way. At times you have to turn away. As Robin says, we only have so many slots, there's only so much time in a day. I think another thing for leaders to think about is those transitional moments. We were talking to a woman leader in a tech firm who came back from maternity leave and came back, into a circle that she'd been in before, but found that she was sort of left off the list of, circulation list. Someone else was sitting in her chair. Those beginnings and endings Robin talked about when you join a company. We've been very interested in thinking about those induction moments, which how can they be more reciprocal? How can they be, how can you feel like you really are coming inside a sort of a Dunbar graph, if you will, or a place of belonging? So we've been focusing on moments of transition. We've been focusing on the leadership being more intentional about who, how you manage, both at a personal level, but also at an organizational level, and also the shapes of organizations as well, and thinking that this is a moment to think about, particularly as we all work, we work in complex systems, where change comes from the bottom, it comes from the edge, it doesn't come from the all-knowing top and get cascaded down. Actually, some of our organizational conceptual structures that are still, if you think of the language we use, still very much based on kind of the Industrial Revolution and the way we think of ourselves as a well-functioning machine. Are they fit for purpose now? And isn't there something more interesting that we could do together?
I'm really struck by your comment there, Tracey, around leaders being not just kind of top down, but also surrounded by teams. And I wonder, Samantha, if you can say, because it was an interesting point in the book around we often assess leaders individually, but actually leaders succeed in the context of their team and the people they manage. Is that something that we could be doing more of, evaluating people kind of in their team context?
Yeah, I think what was really interesting to us as we spoke to people across industries is that you know, the water in which you swim, which is often the team you're part of, can really be an enabler to your thriving or a disenabler, and really recognizing the power and potency of having different people in a team that really allows somebody to be their best selves. It's a really interesting, it's such an interesting tension. We interviewed a CEO who spoke of his regret, actually. He worked in a very high-performing team. It was a very successful team, but it held him in an echo chamber of advice and commentary. And so you're almost having to push against the sort of slight comfort of being with people who really know you, who see you, who are absolutely brilliant at bringing out your best side. But at the same time, there's a reduction around your ability to be kind of perhaps a little bit edgier, to bring in new thoughts. So we write a lot about the tension in our book. We have to work with the grain and against the grain. But as long as you understand both of those, the push and the pull, you have an opportunity to make some really good choices. And in fact, we worked with somebody who was really recognizing the need actually to be exposed to new kinds of thinking. And we designed something called polymathic coaching for them, which is to take them out of their normal kind of conversational groups and introduce them to such a wide range of experts that they were never going to be great friends with. We just don't have the time. It takes about 200 hours to make a friend. But this is more about saying, actually, here's an opportunity to have a conversation with someone completely different, and then come together with your team and bring in what you've learned. And do that in lots of different ways. So that's some of the experiences that we've had, both working with and against this grain.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And I guess that actually makes me a question for all of you guys around how do you get the balance right? So part of the RSA's thinking is around regenerative practice, and we've been observing that sometimes organizations can be very extractive of their employees and staff. And I wonder if the social brain actually has a dark side where you do create the sense of your team as family and you sacrifice yourself. You might, you know, not call out bad practice. You might let certain things slide. And, you know, in the kind of worst sense, that leads to really terrible things like fraud and other kind of instances of malpractice. So I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts as a panel around how can you make the best of the social brain without falling prey to the negative?
Shall I start? I mean, Robin always says nothing comes for free in biology, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, we emphasize, for example, the importance of a sense of belonging, and there's been a lot of research in the last 3 years about that being a huge element for retention of people, for fulfillment at work. But in excess, of course, you can get cultish, exclusionary, you know, unpleasant, you know, sort of groupthink. All of these things in excess can be negative, both in terms of a company exploiting perhaps people's kind of familial, giving relational connection, but also from the employee perspective. I mean, we will free ride at times, you know, if we can get away with it. And I think this comes back to, well, in my book, it comes back to leadership and something that Sam said, you know, at times you've got to work with the grain, you know, so we designed, for example, a cultural gathering for a company that had hired half their people during lockdown, and yet their culture is hugely important to them. And they said, goodness, you know, we haven't even met. There's a lack of confidence even. So to bring everyone together from the chairman through to the most junior employee, for a kind of celebration of culture, but also some really serious learning together as well. And how we did that was on the first day, we used the 7 pillars of friendship to bring people who were nervous actually about meeting their colleagues for the first time, some of them, together with people who shared hobbies or, as we were just saying earlier, shared music taste, and had them in groups of 4, you know, with people who they had a lot in common with, even though they'd never met. But conscious, and what we wanted to show was on the next day, you know, that homophilic tendency may be good for comfort, but actually for performance, for vibrant work, for, you know, really interesting times, you also need to come together with people with whom you have very, very little in common. And so on the second day, we put them, having done this, you know, mapping of their 7 pillars into groups with people that they had the least in common with, you know, embroiderers, with fell runners, with heavy metal drummers and so on, into groups. And there was, you know, that sense that you've got to work with it and against it. That's what we were trying to say on this, in that cultural gathering. Over to my colleagues.
Yeah, I think that actually makes me want to ask a maybe kind of final question, which is, we've been thinking a lot at the RSA about what could go right. And you were sharing just now, Tracey, about some of the things that have gone right for organisations that take this really seriously. Maybe coming first to you, Robin, and then to Samantha, if organisations do pay attention to the social brain, are you able to share some of the things that you think they'll see as a result and some of the progress towards that culture? So maybe Robin, to your thoughts first.
There's 2 comments I might make actually. One is that being embedded, I mean, I think one of the big problems we've had, aside from everything else in the last few years, has been this extraordinary growing pandemic of loneliness, especially among the 20-somethings moving to their first job in a city. They have no idea, you know, where you go to meet people, or they don't know anybody, and the only people they know are at work, who obviously already have family to rush home to at 5 o'clock and all those kinds of things. So you had this terrible loneliness thing. Well, in a lack of friends and loneliness is the single biggest predictor of ill health, and as a direct consequence of that, you know, you have a lot of depression and a lot of physical illness and time being taken off work. So one of the benefits of getting the organization to work more like a village, and people can have feel comfortable and have friendships within it, is simply that their health is going to be better. There's going to be less time lost to ill health, and you know, clearly both parties, the organization and the individual, benefit enormously from that. The other side of the story, though, is what's important about creating this sense of community is it lies in creating the sense of trust and obligation that underpins our natural social world, and if you like, underpins the sense of a village in a small village community anywhere around the world. You know, that's your guardian as much as anything against bad behavior in any form, you know, whether it's stealing the department paper clips or what, you know, it's having that, the community itself acting as its own police force. And you know, small scale communities, that works very, very well because people feel they can say something, you know, to somebody who's stepping out of line. Whereas once you get above that 150 level for a community or any organization, that's when you transition into a much more transactional mode of relationships that people, you know, if we were in a very large organization and you told me off for you know, sort of not washing up my cups or something, I'd be very much inclined to tell you what to do with with my cups and your cups. Whereas in a smaller organization or a smaller unit, and when, you know, doesn't mean say you can't have these kind of grouping sizes within very, very large organizations. organization. In a smaller grouping, people won't do that because they have this sense of obligation to each other, which goes, I understand what the rules are, I understand what the rules of relationships are. Life is just going to be unpleasant if we keep falling out with each other. And so they make that extra effort, and they feel freer to both accept criticism when it's made and feel less threatened by it, but also more willing then to say to people, didn't really like what you did then.
To give that valuable feedback. Well, just final thoughts then from Samantha. Anything that you wanted to add around the benefits of embracing this type of thinking?
Yes, of course. I mean, there are lots of ways of measuring success. We've looked at it through sort of performance, the impact that you want to have, and your ability to innovate. And we have interviewed over 50 business leaders and CEOs and people who are leading incredibly complex organizations. And we have tried to, through taking all of this research, put it into something which we believe, and the research backs us up, and the people that we spoke to, that if you practice and use and really focus on these 6 areas, you will see the benefits in your own organization. And there is a clear connection. And we've used some of the most iconic organizations in the world actually who've practiced what we've been talking about and what we talk about in our book. And we've had the joy actually of interviewing people from those organizations from all over the world. So we think we've contributed to the conversation about how to make organizations really wonderful for new people coming in, for future generations, but also a real sense of, as you say, in the RSA is driving towards this kind of idea of generative organizations. What would it take? So hopefully we've contributed to the conversation about what you could do to enhance your own organization.
I definitely think you guys have. And as I said, please, to everyone watching, please do make sure you get a copy of the book, because there is so much more stuff that we didn't unfortunately have time to discuss, because that is all the time we have today. Robin, Tracey, Samantha, it's been great to speak with you. Thank you again for making time to talk with us. The Social Brain is out now. The RSA have provided a discount code for anyone buying the book through Foils. The code is FoilsRSA20. Both the code and a link to the book will be appearing in the live chat as we speak. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to watch. Thank you to the RSA for hosting this event, and thanks again to our fantastic speakers. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the RSA and how to get involved in their global fellowship community, you can visit thersa.org. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.